Welcome. You're listening to Entertainment U. That's U, period, like university. And I'm Jeanne Corcoran, your Sarasota County Film Commissioner. My office is the Sarasota County Film and Entertainment Office, which means I'm going to talk to you about entertainment of all different kinds, not just movies, not just television, but we'll talk about all forms of entertainment, whether it's live, whether it's recorded, whether it's music or dance or theater or radio or streaming or online. At some point, we hope to touch on all those subjects in an entertaining and educational way. So that's why this is Entertainment U, and it's brought to you by Radio Ear Network and also Society Bites radio shows. So thank you for being out there. Thanks for listening. Now today, we're just going to have a little conversation between me and you about military movies, especially movies that deal with war. I've been doing a lot of research lately on subjects that are based on the military in general and wars perhaps specifically and motion pictures and so forth. And golly, there's a lot of them. In fact, there's so many that I don't think anyone could see them all even if they wanted to and had a library where they could look at the really old ones. But it's interesting how diverse they are because this is such a big subject and it could go on for hundreds and hundreds of movies over the last century. We're going to narrow it down a little bit. I'm going to talk mostly about movies that have been made about wars that are based on historical conflicts. So it might not be your traditional military movie. It might be a movie, for example, there was one that's voted one of the top 100 films in this type of category from 1983 called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. And it is a movie that confronted and tried to understand David Bowie. It was pretty interesting, but it had a lot to do with the character of Major Jack Selliers, who was a British officer. He was captured by the Japanese during the thick of World War II, and he was sent to a POW camp. So it was very interesting to see David Bowie get involved in a film that was basically set around a true military event. That was Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. But you can see that makes it sort of unusual. And there are many lists online. You can go online, you can see the top 100 this and the top 50 that and the top 25 this, that, and the other. It's very diverse. So if I'm not talking about something you've seen and you think should be talked about, go online, read about it, because this is going to be very eclectic. This is a list that I sort of skimmed through. Some I like, some I didn't, but they were worth mentioning. For example, one of my particular favorite movies, which is a fairly recent one from 2016, was Hacksaw Ridge. And Mel Gibson, he directed that. And he, as you know, has been a director of note from The Passion of the Christ to Braveheart and so many other things. But this is an interesting one about a young man who was a pacifist. He was against war religiously and ends up getting involved. It's based on a true story. You know, it was a Seventh-day Adventist who he eventually won the Medal of Honor, and he never carried a weapon. So very, very interesting movie. And the young man who was in that, who starred, which was Andrew Garfield, was one of our Spider-Man actors who has portrayed Spider-Man in his youth. So kind of an interesting movie. And I like the fact that it takes place in the Pacific Theater, but it's so human. It's so much about the humanity of the young man who is at the center of it, but also the humanity of the people that he helps save. Very interesting. And when you think about war movies in general, the ones that truly endure, the ones that last in our memories, it seems that they're always centered on the human story, an individual or a small group of individuals. Some are spectacles of gigantic war movies, but when you drill down, usually at the core, there is a human story about one or more people rather than the entire enormous scope of major wars. There was a film back in 1998, and it starred Dennis Quaid. It was called Savior, 1998, and it was about a Serbian war. So wars are universal. We all have them. They're all over, and it's worth, I don't know, seeing an eclectic mix. So that's kind of where I was approaching this from. There was a movie called Stalingrad, 1993, mostly about Second World War, and it was similar, sort of a German counterpart to the 2001 Russian sniper drama Enemy at the Gates. If you saw that, that was also a very moving, stirring kind of a film. And you may or may not care to go out and listen to and watch foreign movies with foreign subtitles, things like that. Some of them are very, very valuable as well. And as a radio host, we welcome feedback from our audience listeners. So if anybody wants to reach out to Radio Ear Network and give feedback, I'm always willing to hear it, and we'll adapt another show in the future to something you want to hear about. One of my favorites, American Sniper from 2014, directed by Clint Eastwood. Also one of my husband's favorites. He is a military veteran, and sometimes we agree about movies, sometimes we don't. But the American Sniper film, it's not necessarily historical revisionism because it's based on a true story, but every movie has a point of view, and it doesn't always coexist or exactly match what you read in the papers or what you read in a biography or what you read in magazine articles or so forth. This one, it had a lot of sensitivity in it. The main character, Kyle, that was played by Bradley Cooper, had a lot of restrained anguish, and I think that really struck a chord with many, many military men and women that have survived conflict and they've survived action. And sometimes that alone becomes the value of a movie. You know, what is the chord that it strikes with real military people? So American Sniper, if you haven't seen it, is certainly worth watching. Clint Eastwood is a heck of a director, and doing it based on an autobiography of the deadliest sniper in U.S. history, Chris Kyle. It's fairly intense, and the impact on his family and so forth was something I found done quite well in the film. Then let's go back a little bit in history. Take a look at a movie like Kelly's Heroes, 1970. Let's drop back 30, 40 years, and you see that with an odd sense of humor to it, an odd era that it's set in, an odd place that it's set in. And in that one, Clint Eastwood was playing one of the characters. So he was actually playing what they called him, I believe, the khakied man with no name. Don Rickles was in that doing, his basic shtick, and Lots of Wise Guy. Donald Sutherland was in that. A little spaced out, but then again, that's sort of a specialty of his from that era. And, there was an awkward movie in some ways, but it was also a straightforward sort of men on a mission movie with a twist. A team of rogues, Telly Savalas. It was a fun movie if you haven't seen it. It was a interesting movie if you haven't seen it. But it's an older one, Kelly's Heroes from 1970. Worth a look, worth a listen, perhaps. There's also films out there that I've never seen, but they've received a lot of acclaim. Things like Trial on the Road from 1971, which was Soviet cinema. Waterloo in 1970 was quite a spectacle. Waterloo, speaking of spectacles earlier, but again, at its core, it had compelling human characters. Christopher Plummer, who played the Duke of Wellington. He was very smarmy. Rod Steiger was there as Napoleon gone to seed. It was an interesting film. Waterloo, another interesting off-the-wall choice, but I found it compelling when I was reading about it. Think about ones like Hamburger Hill by John Irvin. That was a Oscar darling, and it was flanked by other Vietnam movies. If you'd seen Oliver Stone's Platoon or Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, Hamburger Hill kind of got bunched into the middle between that, and it may have made critics overlook some of its characteristics. But now, when you look back on it, it had a lot of quality to it, and maybe it didn't get the attention that it deserved just because it was wedged in between mega hit Vietnam movies. And of course, it was ahead of its time when you take a look at Black Hawk Down, which is another no-nonsense kind of a film about real events that happened in real war. Anyway, Hamburger Hill, it's not a bad movie. If you haven't seen it, you might want to take a look. There are other ones. If you want to go back in time and look at some historical movies and see some classic actors that are always associated with being heroes and being macho men, lots of testosterone, take a look back at The Sands of Iwo Jima. It was a 1949 film, way before I was born, but according to John Wayne's third wife, this was what helped him become a super patriot. It helped John Wayne form an image in the American mind of a great American patriot, someone who would fight for America. And as an actor, he inspired generations of young men and young women too to be patriotic, to care about the country, and so forth. Sands of Iwo Jima, and there's a lot of psychology in it that you might not have thought would be possible in a book of that age. But it's got a lot of soldierly bonding. It's got a lot of island combat. But John Wayne, as Sergeant Stryker was the character that he played, is one of his most iconic roles. He was hard drinking. He was a tough guy. He was macho, but he was also secretly kind of sensitive. He was secretly, fond of his troops. He cared about his troops. He was prepared to push them to success, but in the end, he really cared about them. And I think that's the leader that every military man or woman wants to have. The one he's tough. He, she, or they are tough. They get things done, but they care about their people. So anyway, the Sands of Iwo Jima is one of my old favorites. You can find them, obviously. You can find war in all kinds of eras and all kinds of stories. Think back, if you haven't seen it, you might want to. In 1964, there was a film called Zulu, and it's a very interesting setting that you may never have heard of. It's about a reenactment of 150 British soldiers that went against 4,000 Zulu warriors. It's very stirring. It's set in the British colony of Natal. It's a single location movie. But again, the people, the stars in it, the characters in it, the story of the officers, the ones that start out, very full of themselves and very pompous, and they have to come and deal with the reality of the scope of being at war and being so totally outnumbered, 150 to 4,000. Michael Caine is in it. Excellent actor, of course. And it was an early time in his career, very young Michael Caine, if you remember him from some of his later movies. Well worth taking a look. And let's see, what else? If you're thinking about major directors, you might think about Richard Attenborough, for example. Back in 1977, he did a movie called A Bridge Too Far, again, a World War II movie, but lots and lots of stars. And it is the story of how the Allies actually made a really big bet on winning the war by Christmas of 1944. And unfortunately, subsequently, thousands were killed, wounded, captured across the Netherlands. You can see it as an adventure, but it's also a spunky story about Brits and spunky Yanks again. Here we go, Michael Caine, Elliot Gould, Edward Fox, incredible actors. And Anthony Hopkins is in it. He does a little thing in there with his glider troupe, well worth seeing. Robert Redford makes an appearance with a paratroop company that gets decimated during a bridge collapse, and Gene Hackman is in it. It's quite a cast. So if you are interested in a star vehicle that got a lot of attention for its time, directed by a major director, Richard Attenborough, take a moment and go rent or Netflix or however you obtain your movies, A Bridge Too Far from 1977. Let's jump a little bit around about the war in 14th century China. That's going to take us in a whole new direction. John Woo directed a film back in 2008 called Red Cliff. And it was based on a 2,000-page book, a Chinese novel, actually called Romance of Three Kingdoms. But it's got major action scenes, massive battles. It's got Navy armadas on the Yangtze River. It's just amazing in its scope. And, of course, John Woo is also one of those directors whose name has gone through decades of success and fame. The film it was retitled to Red Cliff because that made more sense to the director, made more sense to the team. If it was named The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, like the Chinese novel, people might not have come to it. They might not have known that it was a war movie. But it was done pretty well, and there is a lot of trademark violence in there. It's thousands of soldiers attacking. There's all kinds of weaponry. But remember, it's based on a 14th century Chinese novel, so you're going to see spears and arrows and lances and swords and things